Hey there, my name is Khara Plicanic and this is Practical Gradients. I'm going to be showing you how you can use gradients, simple gradients, and custom gradients for everything from design elements to problem solving. Bonus material for this class not only includes all of the practice files, but also a beautiful 22-page workbook. A gradient is just a transition of color from one color to another color, sometimes from one color to another color to another color to another color. Or you can also have gradients where colors shift from being transparent to being opaque. Gradients are everywhere. So whether you're outside looking up at a clear blue sky, or you're on your sofa scrolling through Hulu trying to figure out what you want to watch tonight. So first things first, we can access gradients in a number of different ways. There is, of course, the gradient tool on the toolbar. So if we come up to the control panel and click this down arrow right here, we can scroll through some of the preset gradients. Now, in this version of Photoshop, they are organized in folders, which is really great. So you can see that we have like basic gradients, we've got purples, pinks, reds, etc. And these are really beautiful, super useful, super handy. So we can just pick any of these gradients to play with and test out. So I'm going to click this guy right here. I'll double click to select it and close the window. And over here we can control how the gradient works. There's several different options. We're going to start with what's called a linear gradient. And now if I bring my cursor into the workspace, I can just, let's say, start over here on the left. And if I click and drag straight across and let go, Photoshop places the gradient across the image based on the direction that I dragged and also how long my line was. So the length of the line that you drag determines where that transition is going to happen. So if this is a line across the whole image, if I make a short line like this, we see that that transition or that gradient is much smaller. We can also change the direction of this gradient. So instead of dragging from left to right, if I drag from right to left, I'll get the blue or the dark purple on this side. Or if I drag from top to bottom, or bottom to top, or even, of course, at an angle. To see how easy it is to customize a gradient, we can come up here and instead of clicking on the down arrow, if instead we click right on the gradient itself, that's going to pop open our gradient editor. Now this particular gradient has 3 colors, and we can see that because there are 3 stops. These are called color stops. So this is the first stop, which is this purple color. This one is pink, and then this one is yellow. So let's say we were designing a fall social media post. So we want maybe some fall colors, a fall gradient. So I'm going to click on this dark purple, and instead of this color, I'm going to choose something more reddish orangish, but also like muted a little bit. So maybe like this. And then for this color, I'm going to change it to something gold, maybe there. And for this one, I'm going to change it to orange. So to do that, you can actually double click on the stop itself, or sometimes that ends up kind of wiggling it. Once you click to select the stop, you can click down here to change the color. So this one will make orange. So there's a nice kind of fall continuum. So that's how easy it is to change the colors. We can also add additional colors if we want by just clicking anywhere along the bottom edge here. So if I click right here, I could add, I don't know, maybe we want kind of a green in there. So I can click to add a color. I can also then say, never mind, and I can click and just pluck it off and we'll get rid of it. So the bottom stops control the color, and you can also adjust where the transition happens. So if you click on any of the stops, you'll see these little diamond shapes pop up, and this is like where that transition is happening. So I can drag this closer to the red stop, or I could drag this closer to this stop if I wanted. And all of these stops and the little gradation points are mentioned down here by location. So it's measured in percentages. So this one is at 0, this one is at, let's say, 50, and then this one is at 100. The top stops control opacity. So if we wanted to start with a full opacity color, we click on the opacity stop and we see it's set to 100%. If we wanted the gradient to fade to transparency as it changes in color, we could take this stop and click, and instead of this stop being 100%, we could make this one 0. And then it would start red and it would go through all those color changes, but ultimately it would end up being transparent. I'm going to set this back to 100%. And if we want to give this a name, something happy fall, and then I'll click new, and we see that it gets added down here. And then we can go ahead and click OK. When I look up in the preview up here, the color on the left is what will be at the start of wherever I drag. So if I want the red that's on the left, if I want that to be at the bottom, then I need to start dragging at the bottom. So I can click and drag upwards, and I would get that reddish color at the bottom. If I want the red at the top, I could come up to the top and drag down. That would inverse it. Or, let me undo that. I could also click right here, just click reverse, and then I could draw the same direction and it would actually inverse it. So whichever part of your image that you want the color on the left to begin, that's where you want to start dragging from. All right, so then we could just go get this little fun word art overlay, and I've included this in the course files. You can paste that in here and add a little bit of a texture, and you have a fun, simple design with a very simple 3-color custom gradient. So that's a look at how to manually draw a gradient with the gradient tool. But there are other more flexible ways. So in this example, we are going to add some interest to the background by applying a gradient, but instead of just drawing it on the image or on a layer, we are going to put it as an adjustment layer. And before we do that, I want to take advantage of a really cool thing about gradients, which is the presets that we see when we click the little down arrow right here. The presets are, the first two anyway, are dynamic. So that means that they change based on your current foreground and background color. So right now we see that it looks like black to white, black to transparency, and again, black to white. And you might be like, why do I need so many black and black to white gradients? But here is my little tip. In this case, I just want a gradient that's going to go from yellow to transparent. And the easiest way to do that without even having to mess with the gradient editor is to just choose the yellow that I want. So I'm going to open up my swatches panel and I'm going to choose a nice happy yellow color. And with this as my foreground color, watch what happens if I click the little drop down. Now we see the presets. The first two are different. So this one is now yellow to white because those are my two colors. And the second one is always your foreground color to transparent. So that's awesome. It's already there. And the third one is always black to white, which is also really handy, especially when you are working with masks. Now that we've sort of set ourselves up, we're ready to add the gradient. In the layers panel, you can see that I've already made a selection and I've cut out our subject and put her on her own layer up here. So we're gonna add the gradient adjustment layer in between the background layer and the cutout of our subject. So down at the bottom of the layers panel, I'll click the adjustment layer button and choose gradient, which is not to be confused with gradient map, which we will see later. And then we can just click the little drop down and we see that the first two choices here, again, because they're dynamic, are already set based using this color. So we can see the yellow to transparent gradient right here. So I'm going to click to select that. And here we can choose the style of gradient: linear, radial, angle, reflected, or diamond. So most commonly, you probably will find yourself using linear and radial. So that's what we're going to focus on for now. So I'm going to leave that set to linear. And what's cool is here we can change the angle. And because it's an adjustment layer, we can always adjust this if we want to later. But I want the yellow at the bottom, so I'm just going to leave this set to 90. Now here we can also adjust the scale. So with the gradient tool, we manually set the scale by clicking and dragging, and the length of our drag determined the scale essentially. Here it is on a slider basis. So if I want to scale this up so that the gradient is stretching bigger and bigger, I can do that by increasing it here. Or, if I want to keep it, I still want to see some of the original background, so I'll just leave it around 100%. If you decide that you want the yellow at the top, you can either change the angle or you could click reverse, and that will just turn the gradient the other way. So it's another option there. And we're going to go ahead and click OK. And now we see we have the layer, we have her. So here's a quick before and after, before and after. So we used a simple gradient to just add a little interest to this image. Gradients are not only handy for adding interest to an image, but they can also be a really great problem solver. So in this example, we have an image that's going to be used as a web banner or a header. And we've got some type and a logo, and obviously it's very hard to read. So there are a lot of instances where you need to add type to a graphic or to a photo, and there's just not a good place to put it. Gradients can help you out. Like in the last example where we started by selecting the color that we want the gradient to be, I'm going to do it again here. And I'm going to sample the color out of the image itself. So I'm going to press I for eyedropper. And I'm going to zoom in and come over here and try and select kind of a mid lighter dark green. Is that a thing? From his shirt here. So a color maybe like this. And now, instead of adding an adjustment layer by clicking the adjustment layer button in the layers panel, we're going to add an adjustment layer by just dragging it over from the gradient panel itself. So we'll come up to the window menu and choose gradients. And we see that again, the dynamic choices, presets are right here. So I want this foreground to transparent option. See that it adds the gradient fill over here. We can't see it in the image yet, but we'll change that in a minute. From the gradient panel, we can't actually edit the gradient, except that we can determine the style. And we do that from the menu here. So I'm going to make sure that I've got it set to linear gradient, and I've clicked on this, and that's kind of all we can do right here. So we'll just close that out of the way. And now if we zoom out, we see that the gradient has actually been applied to the type by default. So we just need to take this gradient fill layer and drag it, instead of from the text layer, we need to drag it underneath. So here we see it on the image. And by default, it's coming up from the bottom of the image, and we're going to need to change that. So in the layers panel, we'll just double click on the icon for the gradient fill, and we need to change the angle to be over here. There we go. We need it to be minus 180. So that will put it over here on the right side of the screen. I'm going to zoom out so we can see a little bit better. And then here is where we can control that scale again. Another neat trick that works most of the time, sometimes it's a little bit buggy, but when you are in the gradient options like this, most of the time you should be able to also click, just even with the panel open, click in the image, and you can also click and drag to move the gradient around and change its positioning. So that can also be really handy. And then when we're happy with this, we would just click OK. And if we decide that this green is too dark and maybe it's not playing well with the text right here, we can just double click the adjustment layer and then click the gradient and then click the color stop and the color swatch down here. And then we could pick something maybe a little bit brighter. Click OK, and OK once more. So this image is ready to go out into the wild and look great on a web page. In addition to adding interest to images or helping to solve a design challenge, gradients can just be a design element all by themselves. So if you remember the 80s, the gradients were all the rage back then, and I'm telling you, the 80s are so back. So here is an example where I've created this graphic, and it consists of a bunch of different shapes. So these are all shapes that I made just with Photoshop default custom shapes. And shapes can be filled, as you know, with colors, right? So if I grab my shape tool here, I was just using the custom shape tool and a bunch of these shapes. And if we have them set to shape, we can see that we can, fill them with a color here. But you may not have realized that you can also fill them with gradients. So when we click this fill swatch right here, we can choose none, or this is the default, which is our swatches. But this little button right here is the gradients. So if we click on that, and then we select some of these fun gradients, we see that they will get applied to our shapes. So we can just go through here and apply these gradients to our shapes. You can see here, we can change the angle. So we actually have the ability to do some editing from right here in that panel. So we'll select the ellipse. Kind of tedious, so let's just fast forward this part. Now, instead of being filled with just a flat fill color, these shapes are all filled with gradients, and it adds a lot of energy to the design. But instead of filling with each shape with its own gradient, we can also apply a gradient adjustment layer to all of the shapes as a whole. So to do that, I'm going to click the shapes folder here, and we'll come down to the bottom of the layers panel and click the adjustment layer button and add a gradient adjustment layer. And from the drop down right up here, let's choose maybe a rainbow one like this. And maybe we'll set the angle to something like this and click OK. And now we don't see any of the shapes anymore because it's covering everything up. So now we just want to take this gradient and apply it to all of the shapes in the shapes folder. So we need to drag it out of the shapes folder and up above. And now it's just still covering everything. But we want this to basically override the existing fill gradients that the shapes have. We'll do that by clipping it to that whole folder of shapes at once. So with the gradient fill adjustment layer selected, I'm going to come up to the layer menu and choose Create Clipping Mask. And now that gradient gets applied across all of those shapes. So let's take a peek. If we hide it, we see each of the shapes with their individual gradients. And then with this gradient adjustment layer, we can sort of unify all of them together by applying that gradient across the whole image at once and having it just appear on top of the shapes. And then this cool graphic is almost complete. We can add some cool knockout text for a final design. So the 80s are clearly back, and gradients are a big part of that. But another way to use gradients in another design trend is adding a touch of a metallic sheen or a metallic shimmer to your design work. So here we have a simple pattern with a black and white design, and we can add some depth to this by overlaying a metallic gradient to give it a little bit of a sheen and some depth and visual interest. So how do we do that? We're going to add an adjustment layer. So we'll click the adjustment layer button, click gradient, and we're going to customize this gradient. So we'll click right here on the gradient itself. And we're going to be using 5 color stops. So when you're making a metallic gradient, you can have as many color stops as you want, but you generally want at least 5. So that's what we're going to start with. So I'm just going to click a bunch of times to add 3 more stops. We have 2, 1 on each end. So I'm going to add 3, 4, 5. Okay, now we're going to go through and change their colors. So I'll click to select the first stop and then click the color swatch right here. You can enter whatever color you want here, but if you want to follow along with me, you can just type right into this box. We're going to type D4AA04. That gives us this nice gold color, and we're going to use this color for the first stop and the last stop. So I'm going to copy this hex code and click OK, and then I'll click the last stop and the color swatch and then paste that in. So those are going to be the same. Now we'll click on the second stop and bring up that color. And if you want to follow along, I'm going to type 865F1B. So that is a richer browner color, and we're going to copy that as well. So I'll copy that and we'll apply that to the fourth stop. So the 2 outer stops are the same, the next inner stops are the same, and then this middle stop is going to be its own thing. So we'll double click that, and I'm going to type DDB359. There we go. Click OK. Now the gradient looks not great at all because we need to change the opacity settings. So right now, this opacity is set to 100%, which is good, but this one is set to 0. So I'm going to click the one here on the far right, and we need to change that opacity to 100%. Now, you see what I'm talking about? Now, you can always adjust these and move these around as, maybe you want them to be a little closer together. It's really up to you. I'm going to kind of evenly space everything for now. So that looks good. And then we'll click OK. And here we can see how it will be overlaid. I want it to be at a bit of an angle, so I'm just going to click over here and adjust it like this. And let's go ahead and apply this so we can see how it looks on the pattern, and then we'll make changes from there. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And of course, we'll need to clip the gradient to the pattern. So with that gradient fill selected, we'll come back to the layer menu and choose Create Clipping Mask. And there we see it clipped to the pattern. Now, if we want to change the scale or the angle, we can double click again, and maybe we want to scale this up or scale it down. So you just kind of play with it till you feel like things look good, and then we'd click OK. Now, if we want to also see, maybe instead of applying this metallic effect to a pattern, maybe we want to apply it to text. So we can hide the pattern, and then we can click to turn on this type layer. And you see right now, I've got it filled with just a flat, it's like a gold, I guess, but it's just flat. But if we want to apply the gradient, we can drag this up and again, clip it to this layer. So we could go back to the layer menu up here, or we could hold down Alt or Option and then hover our cursor in between the gradient fill and the layer we want to clip it to. And when you see this funny cursor, you know you're in the right place, and then you just click. And now I think we should change the scale and direction again. So let's double click. This time we'll put this, let's put this right at 90, and then we can adjust. And here's where, remember, we can drag within the image, which is really handy. So I'm gonna scale this down and drag this to be about there. There we go. Remember that we can adjust the scale. I'm just selecting these and holding Shift and then using my arrow keys to adjust it. Oh, I kind of like that too. Decisions. All right, then we would click OK. And there you have a simple metallic effect. Now, if we think, I love this gradient and I want to make sure I save it forever, we want to make sure we save it. So we can double click the gradient adjustment right here and click to open the gradient editor. And we would give this a name like my favorite metal ever, and then click New. Then we'll see it appear right up here and we can click OK. We just turned pixels into gold. Another one of my favorite tricks with gradients is to use it for social media images, whether I'm creating a flat lay mock-up or another type of mock-up. It can be really handy for creating backgrounds and tape, like flat surfaces and walls, and lighting effects as well. So here we have this fun image. I was on an old school 80s kick. So we're gonna add a gradient again. So let's go add the gradient adjustment layer. So from the bottom of the layers panel, again, we'll click gradient and we'll click the gradient editor, and we'll set the opacity over here on this far right slider. We're gonna set that to 100, and we're gonna change the colors. So we'll click the first stop here and the color swatch here and pick maybe like an aqua color. Okay. And for this color, let's pick a pink. Okay. So like that, we'll click OK. But here's what's fun about this. I think you see this a lot on Instagram. Instead of a gradient, what I want is basically just a two-tone background. So you see a lot where social images will have a split background that's like in two colors, and it's often at a diagonal or some funky angle. And you can create that a number of different ways, but you can also do it with gradients. And what's cool is if you take both of these stops and you put them in the same location, the gradient, so the transition between them becomes nothing, just a solid line. So that means I'm going to click the first stop here, and I'm going to set the location to 50%. And I'm going to click the second stop and again set the location to 50%. Ha! And now we have this perfect crisp line instead of a gradient. And if I click OK, I can come up here and, adjust the angle until I get exactly just what I want. If I want to flip-flop it and have the colors on opposite sides, I can click reverse. So maybe I like this best. And then click OK. Another thing I love to use gradients for is product mockups. So whether that is a physical object or I'm maybe mocking up a digital print and wanting to make it look like it exists, like maybe it's really been printed, this is one of my favorite ways to do it. So here we have this camera image, and I'm just gonna hide that for right now. And what I want to do is create a background, okay? So like a wall. So let's go to our adjustment layer and I'll click gradient again. And again, the gradient editor. And again, let's choose something with full opacity. There we go. And now I want to change the color. So I'm gonna click and click the color swatch to select something here. And I'm going to go with, basically what I'm trying to do is whatever kind of color I want this wall to be, I want to select 2 tones of it. So a brighter tone and a darker tone of it. So I'm going to go with this like pink and I'll click OK. And now I'm going to click the second swatch. So I'll select that, click that, and I can sample the pink that I just clicked. And then I can decide, do I want a brighter pink or do I want to go to a darker pink? I think we'll go a lighter one. We'll see how that looks. So we've got the darker pink on this side and the lighter pink on this side. And we'll click OK. And I want it to be linear, and I think I want the bright side to be on the left, so I'll drag the angle until that's reflected. So we see the brighter side over here and the darker side over here, and it's very subtle. So I'm not sure how well it's even showing up for you, but the subtlety is what makes it look good. If it was really drastic, that wouldn't look so good. So we'll go ahead and click OK for now. So that's going to be our wall. And then what I want to do is build a table, a counter for our object. So let's bring our object back on here. I'm going to drag it up so we can see it. So even though this looks pretty good, even by itself, I want to add a countertop or a tabletop to this scene. So I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool and I'm going to draw the counter that I want. So maybe this big, maybe a little, maybe about here. I'll put it just below that little edge. All right, so I've just made a selection with my marquee tool, nothing super special. But then I'm going to go to my layers panel and again choose gradient. And again, I'll start from this gradient, I guess. But I'm going to edit it. So we'll click to bring up the gradient editor. So for this countertop, what I want is like, I want it to be a white countertop, but obviously it can't just be perfectly white. That won't look real at all. So I'm going to go from off-white to more off-white. So let's see. We'll bring up white and then we'll pick like not quite right white. So this shade of gray, whatever that is. And then I'll bring up the second color stop and bring up that color. And then I'm going to mouse over again and you see the cursor becomes an eyedropper. So I can sample the white that I started with. And then I can choose a little bit darker one and we'll click OK. So now we have lighter to darker, and I don't know if that's a big enough difference. So let's lighten up the light one maybe. Yeah, that's probably pretty good. Okay, and again, linear, and we want the lighter side to be on the left. It's hard to tell which one is which, but now I can see that the lighter side's on the right, so I'm going to click over here to flip that. So we want the angle to be 0, and we'll click OK. And you can see that because we started with an active selection and then we made the adjustment layer, that adjustment layer appears only within the selection. So now I just have to drag this down below the camera and ta-da! We have a legit scene from nothing. And if we want to add some extra realism, we can add another gradient to sort of reinforce the lighting. And so to do that, I'm just going to add yet another gradient adjustment layer, this time at the very top of all these layers. And this time I want it to just be black to transparent. So we'll pull up this, we'll change this to black, click OK, OK. Only this time instead of linear, I want radial. And instead of starting with black in the center, I'm going to reverse it by clicking reverse right here. And this, you can see it's still got some green in it. So we need to pull this stop off there. There we go. Whew, that's better. All right, and then let's up the scale. So basically what I want to do is have the clear part of the gradient over here on the left where the light is coming from, and the shaded side over here. So I'm going to keep boosting this up. And you can see I can click and drag around like this. So I'm getting the bright spot of this gradient and putting it on this side. And I'm going to stretch it even bigger. I want it to really be subtle. We'll click OK. And then I'm going to fade this down. And maybe even change the blend mode to multiply. And here's a little before and after. It just kind of ties the scene together. Anytime I'm making these types of mock-ups and I've got different objects, and in this case a completely fake background, I like to have one layer that ties them all together, or at least interacts with all of them. So that's going to be this right here. So we've seen how you can use gradients to solve problems, to add interest to an image, and to take advantage of current design trends. Another thing that we can do with them, of course, is to just play with the color in a photograph. And there are two different ways that we can use them for that. So here we have a fun and colorful image. And we're just going to add another adjustment layer real quick. So same thing, adjustment layer, gradient. And I'm going to pick a wild existing something like this, and I'll click OK. And I'll click OK and just leave it like it is. Now, the fun part is playing with the blend modes. So in the layers panel, you can click right here where it says normal, and we can scroll through these different blend modes, and you can see the way that they interact with the image. So these are kind of fun. And I like how they tie the colors together. And some of them are kind of wild, and we may not find them terribly useful, but some of them are really fun, like this. This is wacky. And if we're talking about 80s trends and just like neon wild colors, I love this look. So this is just a simple gradient in difference blend mode, and we get totally wacky results. Of course, that's, here's exclusion, I think is even better. So have some fun, play around with gradients and play with the blend modes. And then let's take a look at how we can use gradient maps. So earlier I mentioned that there's a difference between a gradient adjustment layer and a gradient map adjustment layer. And here's the difference. If we add a gradient adjustment layer to this, so same thing we've been doing, and I'll just pick another fun preset like this one, and I'll click OK, and I'll click OK, and let's adjust it so it blends. So maybe we'll try something like screen blend mode, okay? So here we have a linear gradient adjustment layer. We've changed the blend mode to screen, and we can see that it's just overlaid on top of the image, right? So if I switch this back to normal blend mode, we see there's yellow on top, pink in the middle, purple at the bottom. When I put it to screen blend mode, we can see the image through it, so that's cool, but it's still colorizing it with the actual gradient itself. So yellow at the top, pink in the middle, and purple at the bottom. The difference is that a regular gradient just overlays on top of the image, while a gradient map actually maps the different colors in the gradient to the tonal values in the image. So here's what I mean. Let's hide this. I'll click back to the background, and we're going to add another adjustment layer, but this time, instead of going up and choosing gradient, we're going to go down and choose gradient map. And for a fair comparison, we'll choose the same gradient and we'll click OK. And look at that. Let's see the difference again. I have to hide this and turn this one on. Okay, so this is just a regular gradient. Remember, it's just an overlay, so we can actually see the gradient. this one is different. It's mapped to the tones of the image. So let's pop open the options here again. So here we can see the gradient, and the gradient map window, workspace, dialog, panel, there we go, looks different because it's different. We don't worry about angle and scale because we're not applying a gradient on top of the image. We're actually mapping the tones. So what that means is if you think of the gradient here, if we think of it as like a histogram, we have our shadows on the left and our highlights on the right and our midtones in the middle. So this image has been mapped so that the shadows are purple, the midtones are pink, and this yellow is mapped to the highlights. And of course we can edit this. So if we click on this, we do get the editor. And if we wanted like more yellow in this image, we could drag this way, and then more of the midtones would become yellow. Or we can have more of the shadows become pink. But it looks really good just by default, I think. Okay, so that's the difference between a gradient and a gradient map. And of course, we can still change the blend mode. So over here in the layers panel, we can scroll through these and see what we like. I mean, they're so pretty. So even though it's still mapping to those tones, we can change the way that it blends. But that's the difference between the mapped version and the overlaid version. I'm going to go over and show you one more image. So here's another image, and I chose these images because obviously they have high contrast with a lot of bright areas and dark areas, so we can really see the mapping and how it works. So let's go back to the gradient adjustment layer, and this time we'll make a map again. And I just want to point out, let's see, what else would be fun? This, I guess. So here's a perfect example. If you pick a gradient like this, we plop it in here, we click OK, and we look at this and we think that looks like a negative. It does look like a negative, and that's because the bright blue is currently mapped to the shadows and the dark blue is mapped to the highlights. So it is a negative, it's an inverse. And it's really easy to fix. You just hit reverse right here. And now we see something that looks a little more recognizable, I guess, to our eyes. And then of course we could change the opacity. We can again play with blend modes. I just love this look, and I love all of the possibilities that exist for using this in a graphical sense and really adding some interest to images and making your design pieces pop. So that is a look at practical gradients, and hopefully you can see how truly practical and useful they really are. So thank you so much for watching and being part of the Photoshop Virtual Summit. I'm Khara Plicanic, and you can come say hello and download my free creative toolkit at kharaplicanic.com.